Hello, Year Nines. I hope you're well. Welcome to this week's Loom video lesson number 10 now. And today we are going to be looking at the impacts of deforestation on the Amazon rainforest. This is part of the 2-week work that came out on class charts on the 8th of June. Last week we were looking at the 6 causes of deforestation. Today we're going to move on to evaluate the 4 impacts of deforestation. So let's just run through that first of all. What are we learning about? So it's to explain and evaluate the impacts of deforestation through the 4 issues, which are economic development, soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and contribution to climate change. What's in it for you? Well, it's to consolidate and improve your understanding of this topic, which you undertook first of all earlier in Year 9, second of all hopefully with the 2-week work from the 8th of June, and hopefully cement your knowledge and to be able to continue to add to it. Well, how are we going to get there? Well, this is the slide from the 2-week pack of work. There I asked you to complete exercises to review knowledge, which included watching video clips. Hopefully you've done that. If you haven't, then I'll give you the opportunity to pick up on those today. And I also asked you to make revision tools. Now, what I'm going to do is ask you to have those to hand today. So you may find something out from this Loom lesson that you can add to it. So please, I would encourage you to do so. So make sure that you've got those to hand. Make sure you've got a pen. Make sure you've got pieces of paper, pencil, whatever you need. I also asked you in the 2-week work to undertake an exam question, and we will run through that today as well. Okay, but before we do that, what I'd like to do is to go back over the 6 causes of deforestation. This was a task that you had. Remember, your brain will delete if you do not repeat. You will soon be fed up of hearing me say this, but it is so true. Remember, I have been spending time in lockdown looking at how the brain works. It's been really, really valuable. And if you keep repeating things, your brain is then programmed to store it so you can recall it at a future time. Very handily, 2 years' time, hopefully, ready for your GCSE. If you don't repeat it at this point, then your brain is programmed to delete it, which would be a criminal waste of your time that you've already put in. So let's do a repetition exercise. What I would like you to do now is to pause this video. You have 6 images there in front of you. I am going to challenge you to remember the 6 causes of deforestation from these 6 images, and then to think of a reason why each of these is significant. So pause this video now. I'm going to pause it for a second as well. And in a moment, we will pick up and we will go through that. Okay, so let's start with number 1. So first, we have farming. So either for cattle or for growing crops. By far the largest contributor to deforestation in the Amazon. Number 2, we got road building, needed to bring in equipment and transport goods and services to and from the cleared areas. Number 3, logging. Despite the extent of tropical rainforest clearance, this is only responsible for 3% of deforestation, which just goes to highlight how much of forest clearance is slash and burn. Number 4, energy development. Another small contributor to deforestation overall, yet one that usually results in large areas of rainforest being flooded to create hydroelectric dams. I know I've used a picture of a different form of energy development there. Maybe I'll change that later on. Remember, with hydroelectric dams, the most common form, the submerged rainforest tends to make the water acidic, which then in turn corrodes the turbines in the dams, so they don't last very long. Number 5, population growth, new settlements. So the more the forest is developed, the more people are required to work there, so more houses and services are needed, and so you chop down some more rainforest to create the space, and so on. Finally, number 6, mineral extraction, commonly for mining gold or for drilling oil, extracting valuable resources from underneath the tropical rainforest. So how did you do? I hope you got all 6, and I hope you found some reasons why each of those are significant from your memory bank, and that your brain is starting to retain this information. So let's move on from the 6 causes of deforestation and now focus on the 4 impacts. So our 4 impacts: economic development, soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and contribution to climate change. Now, in the 2-week work, I asked you to look at these 2 videos. They are really, really useful. I hope you did watch them, and I hope you made some notes from them. If you didn't, now is your opportunity to pause this video and catch up with them right now. They're both filmed really recently. They're both very up to date. And what I'd like you to do is to ask yourself the question: do you have sympathy for the Brazilian ranchers? And are the developed countries of the world, so for example, countries like the United States of America and the United Kingdom, are we equally to blame for the developing situation? So take a pause, take a look at that, and I will speak to you again really shortly. Okay, so in that 2-week pack of work, I really focused more than on any of the other lessons so far, Loom or 2-week pack, on revision. It was a really revision focused lesson, and you'll all be familiar with me talking about this now, that it's important to start constructing revision sources for the work that you've undertaken. So here we're looking at constructing revision sources for each of these 4 impacts. And what I did is I challenged you to think hard about what type of revision materials you find most effective. So for example, is it mind maps? Is it flashcards? Are you a visual learner? Do images help you remember words? So something that we refer to as dual coding. So using an image and a description in order to help you to remember. Remember, as I've said before, your mind will delete if you don't repeat. So what we're looking to do here is to make something that enables the repeating moving forward to be as easy as possible. So once you've got this committed to your long-term memory, how are you going to easily, over the next couple of years up to your GCSEs, be able to recall and then pick up this information again to be able to use to answer your exam questions? So we looked at these 4 different impacts. I'm not going to look at the emerging slides particularly, because I want to focus on the developing and the proficient slides. Remember, I gave you 3 different varieties of slide for each impact. And the reason for that was to be able to give differing levels of information to people working at different levels. What I'm going to hope to do today is just to take you up, each of you, another notch. Now, I gave an example of a mind map that I would draw based on that economic development example. As you can see from the slide here, I am not particularly visual, so I wouldn't be drawing little diagrams, I wouldn't be dual coding. That's just me. Just because that's the way it works for me doesn't mean to say that's going to be right for you. You need to think about the way that is best for yourself. But now, if you've got your revision tools in front of you, let's start looking through some of the notes that I have here so you can compare those to what you've got down yourselves. So let's start with economic development. So split into 2 different categories. On the one hand, here on the left, you've got economic gains, and then on the right, you've got economic losses. Now, the economic gains, we're going to be looking at things like development of land for mining, farming, or energy. So that's looking at a number of those 6 causes there, which lead to jobs either directly or indirectly. What do we mean by that? So if it's directly, that will be people involved in construction of things, or in, for example, the farming itself. Indirectly would be supply and support industries. So, for example, if you need schools in those areas, if I went to teach there, I would be indirectly employed because I will be teaching. Similarly, I will be indirectly employed if I worked in the supermarket because I'm not in the core industry, but I'm in one of those industries that is needed because of the fact that people have moved there. Okay, another economic gain would be the extraction of minerals, so such as gold or oil, which are very valuable. We've looked at examples of this, that work that you did answering that question on the Yansuni National Park that we looked through in the last Loom lesson is a valuable example of that. Improved transport infrastructure opens up new areas for industrial development. Now, this slide also talks about tourism. I would question that. To an extent, yes, it does. But if you are going to completely deforest an area, you're not likely to be getting tourists because the reason for the tourism has just disappeared. And finally, on the economic gains, hydroelectric power. So you're producing cheaper and more plenteous energy for hopefully a wide area, but you're also producing it for that local area there which you are deforesting and developing. Okay, let's move on to the economic losses. So first of all, the number of tourists attracted by rainforests could decrease. The reasons to go there just don't exist any longer. People go to rainforests to witness biodiversity. They want to see plants, animals, trees. They want to see and meet indigenous communities that are living there. They don't want to see fields of crops or fields of cows because you can do that anywhere. Next one, pollution of some water sources and an increasingly dry climate, which may result in water shortages. Well, the pollution that comes from pesticides from farming, the increasingly dry climate, well, remember, trees store water. They produce large amounts of water vapor, which leads to, yes, transpiration. Next, plants that could bring huge medical benefits and high profits may become extinct. Now, in this week's 2-week work that was put onto class charts, now when was it? I get my weeks mixed up now. I think it was last Monday. So it's the current 2-week pack of work. For those of you that have already done it, you will now be aware that there are more than 2,000 tropical forest plants that have anti-cancer properties. And in fact, 25% of all medicines come from tropical rainforests, which is a very, very valuable reason for retaining them. Finally, on that list of economic losses, fires. So the fires that are used to make space for the farming land, they cause pollution. They emit carbon dioxide. If you look at Brazil's carbon dioxide emissions, up to 75% of them come from deforestation, not from industry and not from transport. Okay, let's go on to look at the proficient sheet for economic development. Now, this focuses on a major new study which has some really valuable information in it. Nothing that really surprises me, I've got to be honest. But it confirms that if we look at the first sentence here, chopping down Amazon rainforest has no economic or social benefit for local people in the long term. So it's undercutting the argument that deforestation leads to long-term development. So what they found was that if we look at the fourth bullet point here, the quality of life for local communities improved rapidly when a forest is first cleared, and they look at income levels, for example, and they also look at literacy levels as well. But what you find is that once that initial advantage has passed, obviously the timber and other resources start to dry up. So we're going to go on to look at soil erosion in just a moment. But one of the issues with the removal of the forest is that you remove the nutrients in the soil and the agricultural land. And after that, what are you left with? Nothing. So what tends to happen is that as these populations are attracted to the area because of the income and the jobs that are there, that's great. But as the income and the jobs dry up because the quality of the land has been lost, and as I say, we're going to look at soil erosion in just a second, you're left with a higher population that then has to survive on ever dwindling local resources. At that point, as the jobs dry up and the income reduces, the standard of living gets pushed right down again. You could make comparisons with, for example, mining communities in the north of England, or communities that had steel plants that have closed down. And what's tended to happen in this country is that when these things have closed down, if there hasn't been inward investment to create new jobs and to reskill people, people are finding it difficult to get jobs. The standard of living falls. Nobody wants to move to the area. So even if you had a house that you wanted to sell and you wanted to go somewhere else, you struggle to sell it because nobody wants to buy it. The value of the house falls and you're trapped there. And that's what they're finding with the economic development issues here in the Amazon rainforest. They are very short term. Okay, so soil erosion. One of the first things to remember about soil erosion and the issue of soil in the tropical rainforest is that most of the nutrients are near the surface. Now remember, the plants, vegetation, the trees, they all have shallow roots for that very reason. And it's the roots of the trees and the plants that bind the soil together. So as soon as you start to deforest, it means the soil can easily become loose and erode and disappear. Now, the soil in tropical rainforest is mainly decaying vegetal and animal remains. The soil needs that decaying vegetal and animal remains for the plants and the trees. And it's the stuff from the plants and the trees that actually make up a lot of that decaying remains. Obviously, don't forget the animals as well. They're involved in there. It's all part of this nutrient cycle that creates this constant, enormous biomass. Now, as soon as you take away all that vegetation, as soon as you take away the trees, you have upset that nutrient cycling. And that thin layer of soil, which is the engine for the food supply for the tropical rainforest, it's not going to continue to do the job that it needs to do. In other words, take the nutrient cycling away, remove the rainforest, you can only grow crops or graze animals for so long before the nutrients run out in this thin layer of soil. That is, if it hasn't already been washed away anyway. So let's look at the proficient slide. I think we've covered an awful lot of that with what I've just said, but there's one particular point that I wish to draw your attention to, which is this at the very bottom of the page. The topsoil also holds huge amounts of carbon, which is now known to have a major potential influence on CO2 levels in the atmosphere and hence a major potential influence on climate change. Now, again, in this week's 2-week work, or this cycle of 2-week work that's out there at the moment, for those of you that have already done it, you'll know that trees absorb carbon dioxide by photosynthesis. So you cut down the trees and you remove a fantastic natural carbon storage system. So it's not just the topsoil, it's the trees as well. Particularly important, therefore, that we look after them. Okay, so that's our soil erosion. Let's now look to climate change itself and move on to those developing slides and then the proficient ones. Okay, so deforestation can have an impact on the local and global climates. It's important to remember this is not something that is simply limited to the Amazon. As we've just said, during photosynthesis, trees absorb CO2 and emit oxygen. We've spoken about the photosynthesis, we've spoken about the CO2 storage, but yeah, as part of that, it's emitting oxygen as well. In fact, 28% of the world's oxygen is coming from rainforests. So CO2 is a greenhouse gas, partly responsible for global warming. By retaining the rainforests, we're absorbing CO2. The trees are storing the carbon, helping to reduce the rate of global warming. So deforestation affects climate because of these two things. Giving off moisture by the process of transpiration. So deforestation reduces the moisture in the air, resulting in a drier climate. And second, the process of evaporation uses up heat and cools the air. So if trees are cut down, this cooling ceases and temperatures rise. So onto the proficient sheet. Now, let's look at this point here in particular. Mature forests store enormous quantities of carbon, both in the trees and vegetation itself, and within the soil in the form of decaying plant matter. So forest areas such as in the Amazon represent some of the world's largest carbon stores on land. Here next as well, deforestation. Now we've already mentioned that up to 75% of Brazil's emissions come solely from deforestation. We covered that and when we were looking at economic losses. And here's something that I think is particularly important. Preventing deforestation will be a relatively cheap method of tackling climate change, allowing forested countries to reduce their emissions by enormous amounts. Now we've looked at obviously these sort of things in that Yasuni National Park question that we reviewed in the last Loom lesson. I think something we need to bear in mind though, Brazil is a very much larger scale rainforest than the Yasuni National Park example, which I believe was in Ecuador. Also, Brazil is a newly emerging economy. So it's developing, it's looking to establish itself, it's looking to develop its economic strength, whilst at the same time, countries such as the USA and the United Kingdom, I'm sure will be happy to see it remain not as strong as we are. Which actually then begs the question, should Brazil be getting help from other nations? Because this is a bigger issue than just Brazil, its emissions. This is something that's affecting all of us. But at the moment, we don't seem to, as a world, be able to come together and properly discuss this and remove wealth and remove the issue of politics. Okay, so now let's move on to the loss of biodiversity. So, apart from losing animal species, I think it's important to also note that if we lose the biodiversity, we will be losing, as we mentioned earlier, more than 2,000 tropical forest plants potentially. And let's bear in mind the anti-cancer properties that they have, which will also be a source of income for these countries as well, if they are harvested, if they are used, and this is done in a sustainable way. So that's a potential economic loss that we're looking at here, as over and above the fact that potentially it's a loss to humanity. Surely it's better to sustainably manage these things than it is to actually see them lost to the whole of the world. Moving on to the proficient sheet here. one thing in particular that strikes me first up. Though few species are killed off directly in forest clearances, many face a slower death sentence as their breeding rates fall and competition for food becomes more intense. Think back to the work that we've done on food webs and how if you upset the balance in a food web, there can be catastrophic consequences for different parts of it. This is a particularly potentially serious example of that. And you can see here as well some of the expectations, which would be really useful information for exam questioning when you're looking to provide evidence to get really, really good marks. Where we're looking at, where are we? At least 15 mammal, 30 bird and 10 amphibian species are expected to die out locally by 2050. There are more optimistic scenarios which would require cattle ranchers and soy farmers to comply with Brazilian environmental laws. If they do that, then the extinction numbers could be held closer to 38 species. But whichever way we look at it, either looking at losing 55 species or 38 species, we are still looking at a significant net loss if we carry on the way that we have been at the moment. Okay, so that takes us through the 4 different impacts. Hopefully that explanation has cemented your knowledge, maybe answered some queries that you had, given you an opportunity to be able to supplement your revision notes, given you a chance to look at them and ask yourself the question, are these going to really be helpful to me when these lessons are a distant memory? Am I going to be able to look at them and understand, okay, yeah, I know what that was about. Let's refresh my memory. Let's put it back into perspective. Now, also on that 2-week pack of work from the 8th of June, we had this exam question asking you to study the following information about deforestation in Brazil. So between 2012 and 2013, after several years of decline, the rate of deforestation in the Amazon rainforest increased by 28%. Illegal logging and the burning of forests to provide land to grow crops for food and biofuels and to graze cattle has left thousands of hectares of land bare of vegetation, allowing the heavy rains to wash soil into rivers. And we know how that happens because the soils are very, very shallow. The majority of Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions are from burning forest, with the removal of forest also resulting in there being fewer trees to absorb CO2. Agriculture is important to the economy of Brazil, with the demand for agricultural produce expected to increase. So that's the statement there which summarizes what we have been learning in this lesson. So the question is asking you to describe 2 effects that deforestation in Brazil is having on the natural environment. And it's asking you to use information from the box for your 4 marks. So in bugging that question, so our command word there is describe. So describe is asking you to set out characteristics. But remember, if you're describing something, it is not enough just to name the effects. You need to give reasons why for each as well. And use connecting phrases such as therefore or which leads to. So what I've done is look at the, let's actually change our screen here because I have on another PowerPoint come up with a potential model answer. Now, this is just one that I've come up with. There are various different ways that you could look to answer this question. But the key to this sort of question is you've got 4 marks. You really need to be making 2 points. And for those 4 marks, One is going to be to simply highlight the effects, but then, as we say, you've got to go on to describe. You use your connecting phrase. You need to be providing some additional information from your knowledge to nail this and get 2 marks for each point. Now, what I've done with this possible answer, so this is just one way you could do it, is I have highlighted in red the information that I have taken straight from the information within the question. Now, remember, this is inviting you to use the information from the box. So from this bit here. So a possible answer could be the burning of forests to provide land to grow crops for food and biofuels and to graze cattle leads to thousands of hectares of land left bare of vegetation. So that is one effect that deforestation in Brazil is having. Burning of forests leads to thousands of hectares of land left bare of vegetation. So I have lifted that pretty much straight out of the text there. But then, using my connecting phrases, so which leads to, I'm then explaining what the impact is. So leads to soil erosion, as without the roots of the trees and plants, the soil can be stripped away very easily by wind and rain. So that's just straightforward, simple information that we've learnt from the evidence that we've examined. So that would get us our first 2 marks. To get the next 2 marks, so the demand for agricultural products, or that should say is expected to increase because farming is important to the economy of Brazil. What I've done is I've taken that from this paragraph here. So agriculture is important to the economy of Brazil, with the demand for agricultural produce expected to increase. However, so that's my connecting phrase. This will lead to further deforestation as more land is needed to both increase output and to replace the land from which the soil is eroded and crops will no longer grow. So not only have we made our statement, we have described the effects. That, ladies and gentlemen, will give you 4 marks. There are other things that you could use from within that statement to describe. If you are marking your own work, then just look to see, have you taken the information from the box? Have you used the connecting phrases? Have you then gone on to properly describe the effects? If you have, then please by all means send them in to us and we will double check if you want any reassurance. Be really happy to look at your work. If you haven't, then look at this model and then pause this loom and take an opportunity in another coloured pen to review your work and come up with an answer that you know in future you can use as a model in order to be able to get 4 marks out of 4. Okay, Year 9, this is the end of today's loom lesson. Take care for another week. I will look forward to providing you with loom lesson number 11 next week. In the meantime, bye for now.